What happened when empathy disappeared from humanity? It began on a Tuesday, not with a bang, not with a virus, not with a meteor, but with a silence so profound it was almost inaudible. People simply stopped caring. Dr. Eris Thorne first noticed it in the hospital cafeteria. He was a neurologist at the New York General Medical Center, a man whose life was built on the intricate architecture of the human brain and the delicate chemistry of human connection. He'd just lost a patient, a young mother, Maria Reyes, who'd succumbed to an aggressive glioblastoma. The surgery had been a marathon, a desperate 12-hour gamble against time and biology. He was exhausted, his scrubs stained with the evidence of his failure. And for a moment, he just stood in the doorway of the cafeteria, his hands trembling slightly. He needed a cup of coffee, a quiet corner, a single human moment. He saw Nurse Patel, who had held Maria's hand through her final, terrifying hours. She was sitting at a table, scrolling through her phone, a half-eaten sandwich in front of her. He walked over, his own grief a heavy cloak on his shoulders. "Priya," he said, his voice rough. "Maria, she didn't make it." Priya looked up, her expression utterly blank. Not sad, not surprised, not even professionally concerned. It was the face of someone being told that the vending machine was out of their favorite soda. "Okay," she said, and went back to her phone. Eris felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. It wasn't anger or disbelief. It was the utter vacuum where a response should have been. He mumbled thanks and retreated to the coffee machine. On his way, he passed two orderlies who were arguing, not over a scheduling conflict, but over who had to clean up a biohazard spill. Their voices were sharp, devoid of any of the usual dark humor or shared burden that usually lubricated such tasks. "It's your turn, you lazy sack," one hissed, his eyes narrowed with pure, unadulterated contempt. There was no history there, no camaraderie, just a transactional hostility. That was the first day. By the end of the week, the world had irrevocably changed. The phenomenon, which the scientific community would later dub global affective disconnection, GAD, didn't spread like a plague. There were no symptoms, no fever, no cellular mutation. It was an overnight, global neurological event. Every single human being on the planet, from a newborn to the centenarian, simply lost their capacity for empathy. It was as if a master switch in the collective human brain had been flipped off. The initial consequences were chaotic, yet eerily predictable. In London, a man shoved an elderly woman onto the underground tracks because she was in his way. In Sydney, a driver deliberately rammed his car into a cyclist who had the temerity to be in the bike lane he wanted to use as a shortcut. In Toronto, a customer in a grocery store screamed at a cashier for 5 minutes over a 10-cent pricing error, his face a mask of pure, unreasoning fury. Acts of kindness vanished. A dropped wallet was a prize to be claimed, not returned. A child crying on a bus was an annoyance to be ignored or, worse, shushed with a snarl. Government scrambled. Emergency broadcasts urged citizens to remain calm and considerate, but the words were hollow. How could you ask someone to be considerate of another person's feelings when they could no longer conceive of those feelings existing? Police forces were overwhelmed. Their training in de-escalation was useless against a population that could not be reasoned with or emotionally connected to. Why would a looter feel any remorse for smashing a storefront window when the owner's distress was as invisible and meaningless to him as a rock's? Economies began to falter. Supply chains, which rely on a complex web of trust and mutual obligation between countless individuals and companies, started to fray. A trucker in Kansas, no longer feeling any pressure to meet a deadline out of a sense of responsibility to the people waiting for the medical supplies in his trailer, simply parked his rig and went home. A factory manager in Manchester saw no reason to maintain safety protocols for his workers. He didn't care if they got hurt. He only cared about the bottom line, and cutting corners was now the only logical path. The concept of a social contract dissolved into dust. But the most astonishing and terrifying aspect of GAD was its effect on families. The bedrock of human society, the intimate unit built on love, care, and self-sacrifice, was the first to crumble. In a suburb of Melbourne, a teenage boy, Liam, came home to find his mother had changed the locks. "Your room is costing me money," she told him through the door, her voice flat. "Rent is $800 a week. Pay up or leave." She wasn't being cruel in a calculated way. She was simply stating a financial fact. His pain, his confusion, his fear of being homeless. These were not things she could perceive any more than she could perceive the color ultraviolet. In a small town in Scotland, an elderly man with dementia, who had previously been lovingly cared for by his daughter, was found wandering the streets in his pajamas. His daughter was at work. She decided the burden of his care was too great. She didn't hate him. She just didn't care. The deep, instinctual biological drive to protect one's kin, which had been the engine of human survival for millennia, had been switched off. Parental and filial love, it turned out, were not magic. They were complex neurological processes, and their central processing unit was empathy. The world became a place of perfect, brutal logic. Every action was stripped down to its most basic, selfish calculus. "What's in it for me?" became the only moral compass. Cooperation vanished. Why would two people work together on a project if the only goal was to maximize one's own individual gain? Teams dissolved into factions. Offices became battlegrounds of pure, unadulterated self-interest. A project manager in Vancouver, whose team had just landed a major contract, immediately fired his two best developers to cut costs, keeping the entire bonus for himself. He didn't feel a flicker of guilt or even the ghost of loyalty. It was simply the most efficient outcome for him. Art, music, and literature, entire industries built on the exploration and communication of the human emotional experience, collapsed overnight. A symphony was just a sequence of sounds. A novel was just a string of words. A painting was just a collection of pigments on a canvas. There was no one left to feel moved, to be inspired, to connect with the artist's soul. Galleries closed. Concert halls sat empty. Publishers filed for bankruptcy. The shared cultural language of humanity went silent. The news media, once a forum for shared understanding and, at its best, a source of communal outrage or celebration, devolved into pure, transactional infotainment. News anchors delivered stories of mass starvation in a neutral, dispassionate tone, as if reporting on the weather. Why evoke a reaction in an audience that could not feel? Instead, the focus shifted entirely to stories that serve a direct, selfish purpose. Stock tips, celebrity gossip, a new form of gladiatorial entertainment, and warnings about personal threats. The concept of fake news became meaningless. All news was just data to be used or discarded based on its utility to the individual. Religion, for all its complex doctrines and rituals, had always been grounded in a core principle of compassion. Love thy neighbor, do unto others. Without empathy, these tenets became empty, archaic rules with no emotional or spiritual weight. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples emptied. Why gather to worship a God of love when you, yourself, were incapable of love? The faithful were left with only a shell of ritual, a series of meaningless actions devoid of their original purpose. Faith, it seemed, was inextricably linked to the ability to feel for others. And then, the global infrastructure began to fail. The internet, a marvel of human collaboration, started to break down. The people who maintained the undersea cables, the server farms, the complex routing protocols, they were all suffering from GAD. Their work was tedious, difficult, and often thankless. Without the empathy that previously made them feel a sense of duty to the billions of users who relied on their work, they simply stopped showing up. Why maintain a system that served others when it offered them no direct, personal reward? Social media platforms, once vibrant, if chaotic, town squares, became ghost towns of automated bots and abandoned profiles. The last human posts were terse, angry demands, and advertisements. The power grid was next. In a hydroelectric plant in Canada, a technician saw a critical warning light. Fixing it would require a dangerous 2-hour climb down a maintenance shaft on his day off. He looked at the light, calculated the risk to himself versus the benefit to the faceless, feeling less masses that would lose power, and turned off his radio. He went home. The cascade failure that followed plunged an entire province into darkness. Hospitals ran on backup generators for a few days until their fuel ran out. Water treatment plants failed. In a matter of weeks, the lights of civilization began to flicker and die, not from a lack of technology, but from a lack of the one thing that made that technology worth maintaining: care for one another. Human civilization, it turned out, was not built on steel, concrete, or silicon. It was built on an invisible, fragile, and utterly essential foundation: empathy. It was the glue that held every contract, every promise, every social norm, and every act of cooperation together. Without it, the entire structure was sand. But the story doesn't end there, because Ayers Thorne was still working. In the basement of the now mostly empty New York General, Ayers had turned his lab into a fortress of desperate research. He was alone, but not out of choice. His research assistant had simply stopped coming to work one day, leaving a half-written report on her desk. The hospital administration had collapsed into a free-for-all of department heads, trying to claim the remaining resources for themselves. Ayers had barricaded his lab door and kept working. He wasn't driven by a noble desire to save humanity. His capacity for that grand emotion was gone too. He was driven by a simple, pure intellectual obsession. What happened? He had access to a wealth of neurological data. He began analyzing brain scans of patients from before and after the event. He cross-referenced them with fMRI data, EEG readings, and genetic markers. He worked for days on end, sleeping on a cot in the corner, his world reduced to the glowing screens and the hum of his machines. He ate protein bars and drank water from a cooler. His own biological needs a simple set of inputs to be managed. His breakthrough came not from a complex analysis, but from a simple observation. He was reviewing a scan of a stroke patient from 6 months before the event. The stroke had damaged a very specific, small cluster of neurons in the patient's right supramarginal gyrus, a region known to be involved in our ability to perceive the emotional states of others and to distinguish them from our own. The patient had exhibited a marked, but not total, deficit in empathy. Ayers then pulled up a scan of Nurse Patel, taken just 2 days before the event, for a routine checkup. He compared it to a functional scan he'd managed to get of her during a brief, chaotic encounter in the hospital hallway a week after the event. The difference was stark, not just in the right supramarginal gyrus, but in a whole network of regions: the anterior insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, the temporoparietal junction. All the key players in the brain's empathy circuit were showing a complete and total lack of activity. It wasn't damage, it was a system-wide power down. He then made the connection that would change everything. He checked the global astronomical data logs for the week of the event. There it was. On that fateful Tuesday, a massive, previously undetected solar flare had swept through the inner solar system. It had been a geomagnetic storm of unprecedented power, far stronger than the Carrington event of 1859. But instead of just frying electronics, this one had a strange, subtle secondary effect. It had emitted a specific, complex burst of electromagnetic radiation, one that resonated perfectly with the precise frequency of the brain's social empathy network. It wasn't a virus. It wasn't a weapon. It was a cosmic accident, a freak alignment of solar physics and human neurology. The sun had quite literally switched off our capacity to care in a single, silent pulse. Eris sat back in his chair, the truth of it washing over his own disconnected mind. He felt no awe, no horror, no despair. He simply felt a sense of completion. The puzzle was solved. But then, a new thought entered his head. A simple, logical thought. If this was a neurological event caused by an external electromagnetic stimulus, could it be reversed? In a world without empathy, no one would care to try. No government would fund it. No corporation would see a profit in it. The very idea of saving humanity was meaningless. But Eris Thorne was a scientist. His mind worked in problems and solutions. The problem was a deactivated neural network. The solution, in theory, would be to reactivate it. He spent the next 3 months in his basement lab, surrounded by the failing hum of a dying city. The power was sporadic now, so he ran his equipment off a massive bank of scavenged car batteries and a jury-rigged solar array on the hospital roof. He used his knowledge of the specific neural frequency he'd discovered and began to design a device. It was a crude helmet, lined with coils of copper wire, connected to a control box filled with salvaged circuit boards and oscillators. It was a machine designed to emit a targeted electromagnetic field, a precise counterfrequency to the one emitted by the solar flare. He had no test subjects. He had no one to help him. He had only himself. One cold December morning, the city outside his lab window was a tomb. The streets were empty, littered with abandoned cars and the detritus of a collapsed society. A thin layer of snow covered everything, muffling the world into a final, silent peace. Eris knew he was running out of food. He knew the batteries wouldn't last much longer. He looked at his device, his life's final, desperate work. He sat down in his chair, his hands steady. He placed the helmet on his head. He took a deep breath, not out of fear, but out of a simple, final preparation. He flipped the switch. There was a low hum, a vibration in his skull. For a moment, nothing happened. His mind was the same quiet, logical, selfish space it had been for the past year. He felt nothing for the dying world outside. Nothing for the memory of Maria Reyes, nothing for anyone or anything. And then a flicker. It was so faint he almost dismissed it as a trick of his exhausted mind. It was a memory, but not just a visual memory. It was the feeling of a memory. He remembered holding his daughter's hand on her first day of school. He remembered the warmth of her small fingers in his, the way her eyes had been wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. And for the first time in over a year, he didn't just remember the event, he felt it. He felt his own protective love for her, a love so powerful it had once been a physical ache in his chest. A single, hot tear rolled down his cheek. He hadn't cried in over a year. He hadn't been able to. He was flooded, not with joy, but with a crushing, unbearable weight of grief. Grief for his daughter, who was somewhere out in that dead world. Grief for Maria Reyes. Grief for Nurse Patel, for the old man in Scotland, for the teenage boy in Melbourne, for every single person on this planet who was now living in a silent, selfish hell of their own making. He felt the collective pain of 7 billion isolated souls, and it was a tsunami that threatened to drown him. But in that unbearable pain was something else. hope. The connection was back. The switch had been flipped. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't save the world by himself. He was just one man in a basement. But he had the blueprint. He had the answer. He spent his final days, his final precious hours of battery power, not trying to build another device, but documenting everything. He wrote his findings in clear, precise, logical terms on a hardened data drive. He recorded a video message, his face a mixture of profound sorrow and fierce, desperate determination. He described the solar event, the neurological mechanism, the design of the helmet. He explained that it was possible, that humanity could be switched back on. He sealed the drive in a lead-lined, waterproof case. He wrote on the outside, in bold, clear letters, "T.O. whom it may concern. This is how you fix U.S." Then, on his last day, with his food gone and the final battery at 3%, Ayers Thorne put on his coat and walked out of the hospital. The city was a frozen, silent monument to the cost of disconnection. He walked for miles through the skeletal remains of civilization until he reached the old, abandoned New York Public Library. He knew its foundations were solid. Its stone walls would last for centuries. He found a secure, dry spot in the deepest sub-basement, behind a collapsed wall of forgotten archives. He placed the case there, in a cavity he carved out of the rubble. He covered it with bricks and dust, making it look as old as the ruin around it. He sat down on the cold floor, his body weak, and his mind now fully, agonizingly aware of his own mortality and the tragic beauty of the world he was leaving behind. He didn't fear death. He welcomed the quiet. But as he closed his eyes for the last time, his final, empathetic thought was not for him, but for the future. He hoped someone would find his message. He hoped they would have the will, the cooperation, the shared purpose to rebuild. He hoped they would remember the terrible price of forgetting how to care. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a blanket of white, as if to erase all evidence of humanity's greatest failure. But deep beneath the city, in a forgotten tomb of knowledge, a tiny spark of hope remained, a spark that held the blueprint for humanity's greatest strength. The world had forgotten empathy, and it had nearly died. But the truth was, empathy was not a luxury. It was not a soft, optional add-on to the hard logic of survival. It was the very core of it. It was the invisible architecture of our shared existence. And as long as even one person remembered what it was and how to find it again, there was a chance that the lights of civilization could one day be turned back on.